Good afternoon, everyone. Please come in, take a seat, a virtual one. All right, and I think we can start officially the webinar now. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Welcome to this webinar that EUA, the European University Association, is organizing as part of a series called Towards the Bologna Process Ministerial Meeting. This webinar will be dedicated to internationalization and mobility policies and practices in the context of this Bologna series. So in case you have not attended the first webinar of our series, this series aims to open up a bit the perspectives with the view that the next Bologna Process Ministerial Meeting will take place this November, on the 19th and 20th of November. And the idea at the EUA was that it was timely to shed light on some topics that are related to universities' policies and actual practices, but that one would not always relate to the Bologna process and discussions taking place in the Bologna process. So this series has a total of 7 webinars. This is the second one, and today we will just talk about internationalization and mobility policies and practices. Before I start and introduce you to my speakers here, I would like to go through a few technical features for this webinar with you. The first one is that we have 3 ways of interacting with you. So you can see those in the right box of your screen. At least on my screen, it's on the right side. So you have 3 tabs there. One is chat. The second tab is called Q&A, and the third tab is called polls. In the chat, well, this is a chat box, so it's usually, well, I see that you have already started, so it usually serves to what the chat box serves to. So greetings and also technical questions, and if you have other remarks that you would like to share with the speakers, but also with the audience. If you have questions, so content-related questions or questions to speakers, please don't use chat, use the second tab, which is called Q&A. And here you can put your questions to our speakers. It's a moderated box. So it means that when you type in your question, it does not automatically appear, and this is normal. I have a colleague who is driving this through. And we will pick up questions from that Q&A box, Q&A tab, to feed the discussion with our speakers. And the third way of interacting with us is the third tab you have on your right-hand box, which is polls. And twice during this webinar, we will have a little live poll running. And of course, you will be asked to participate to that poll. And then once the poll is closed, under the sub-tab closed, under polls, you will be able to see the results. All right. So I will probably need to get back to that in the course of the webinar, but for the time being, I think this suffices as technical information. Our last point is that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be uploaded on the EUA YouTube channel after the webinar. All right, all this being said, I would like to introduce you, and I'm really pleased to introduce you to my speakers for this webinar. The first one is Michael Gebel, who many of you already know, I'm sure. He's the Director for Higher Education Policy at the EUA. My second speaker here is Magali Sunen, who's policy officer at the policy advisor, at the Flemish Ministry of Higher Education here in Belgium. And you might also know her because she's the co-chair of the Bologna Coordination Group on the Global Policy Dialogue. My third speaker here is Pauline Ravinet, and Pauline is the Vice President for European Affairs at the University of Lille in France. And we actually also know well Pauline because Pauline is researching on the Bologna process and has been doing so for quite a while already. So we can also rely not only on her experience as a Vice President, but also on her research expertise on the Bologna process. And last but certainly not least, we also have Marcus Leighton, who who's with us today as a speaker. Markus is the head of international affairs at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And should I even introduce him still, but he was also the past president of the European Association for International Education, the EIE, which is holding its community exchange, replacing its annual conference also this week. So here we go for the introductions. I would like to first start by a short presentation with Michael, and Michael will give us a little bit of the state of play for internationalization in the Bologna process and different ways to understand even the word internationalization. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Therese, and good afternoon, everybody. So this is just to set the stage, what we are actually talking about, because nowadays the Bologna process is not always immediately linked to internationalization when you talk about it. So if you look back some 20 years when the process started, it had in fact two international goals already set out. And the one was, of course, implicit in the European higher education area. So you really tried to build an area with converged structures for quality assurance, recognition, and the joint degree structure with the credit points. So basically create an environment where you could have more cross-border mobility and more collaboration. And if you look back in the Sorbonne and in the Bologna Declaration, these are clearly spelled out as goals. So it was about enhancing the quality, transforming the systems, improving them, but it was also to make them much more international. But what was also mentioned there, and on equal footing, I would say, is the international recognition and the attractiveness of the European higher education area, the EHEA itself. And this had been a little bit forgotten in the first 5 to 6 years of the Bologna process. When you talk to colleagues who have been there at that time, it was probably because one was too busy with the internal business and couldn't think about how that would relate to the rest of the world. But that started in 2005 with the Bergen community. A working group has been installed on what was then called the external dimension, which I found that was the period of time when I came in the Bologna process personally. And I came actually at the time from Asia, and I found that very strange to think of this as coming from the external dimension. But as you can see, in 2007, the title of this, the concept had changed a bit. It became the strategy of the Bologna process in a global setting. And this has actually been probably unnoticed by many. This has actually been the first European strategy for internationalization. Before the Commission, long before the Commission strategy came, which was only launched in 2014 for the European Union. And it was at the time also a bit contested on whether that would be actually possible, because inside Europe, you had the strong feeling that you could collaborate and exchange on all kinds of things. But when it came to internationalization, every country was on its own, and it was in first instance competition. And I think it was one of the mission goals of the Bologna process also to offer an alternative to a too strong focus on attracting degree students, fee-paying degree students, which was very much en vogue at that time and was seen as a strong indicator for success in internationalization. How many international fee-paying students do you get in? So you can see there the agenda that was put up was actually about information and promotion about the Bologna process and the European higher education area, which was still to be established itself. That was very important because there were more and more questions raised on what was happening in Europe. Suddenly there were shorter degrees than there was before. It was from 5 to 6 years. They became 3 to 4 years. And colleagues in particular in North America, but also in other parts of the world, were a little bit in doubt on whether they could actually recognize and accept them. An important point that was also made was about partnership, so that it was not just about competition, and then also dialogue, so that Europe, with its self-defined structures, to unite and have more intra-European exchanges, that this would not become something exclusive, inaccessible for the outside. So one idea was to have constant dialogue with other parts of the world, and keep each other's abreast of where the developments would go. And the last point is, of course, recognition, which is underpinning any international exchanges. In 2009, then, we had an innovation. The first global dialogue meeting actually took place, the first Bologna Policy Forum, and that was here not far away from Brussels in Leuven, where for the first time international ministers and international associations had been invited for a tour de table, an exchange on Bologna, but also on global perspectives in general. And ever since, we had actually had these global dialogue events, this Bologna Policy Forum, in slightly different settings. And I think we are still experimenting with this and trying to find the right format for that. So that was the situation about until 2009-10. And just to illustrate how meaningful and powerful that was at the time, the Bologna process, despite the fact that it was not uncontested, and you had many protests from students and staff at that time against the Bologna process, it nevertheless was very much recognized by the higher education institutions. In the Trends 2010 reports, we asked our members about what had impacted in the past 2-3 years their institutional strategy development. And here you see the answer. So the Bologna process is clearly as number one, as also the most comprehensive and encompassing approach, of course, then followed by quality assurance, internationalization, governance reforms, and so on. That was 2010. But already at the time, we asked them, how will this develop in the future, in the next 5 years? And that was the answer. So it was clear that the Bologna process wouldn't stay there. QA was seen, QA and internationalization were actually predicted to get up to the first rank. Well, I think this brings us to today's situation, where we can clearly see that Europe has gained through the Bologna process in various ways. I think it has become an established destination and also partner region in international higher education, and that this Bologna process, the European higher education area, was at least a useful backdrop, but probably also much more for the different countries. So we have all gained in visibility internationally. And then I think it has also changed very much and promoted the ways in which we collaborate and exchange. So short-term credit mobility hasn't existed before. It has now, and the same is true for partnership. I remember the first meetings that we had with our North American colleagues, where we just concluded that they were very good at attracting students, and we were actually very good in having these kind of partnerships, which were hitherto unknown to them, and also joint degrees, of course. And all this has also been promoted not only inside Europe, but also to third countries, and even more so since this became part of the Erasmus program in 2014. So that's actually very good. But then the question remains, what does the Bologna process mean nowadays for internationalization? Has it still a global appeal? Is it still visible around the world? Does institutions still rely to the Bologna process in their own internationalization, given that they made so much progress and the whole internationalization has so much developed over the past years? And you could argue that the institutions are actually far ahead probably of the Bologna process itself. Then the question is, what are in 2020 then the messages and action for internationalization that the Bologna process still holds? That was my introduction here, and I hope now that we can enter a very interactive discussion on these topics.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. Yes, indeed, because actually that was the only presentation as such of this webinar. The rest will be discussion with the panel of speakers we have now. I just would like to make a small technical point before we start. I see that some people are raising their hands in the chat box. Well, I'm sorry, but we are not using this feature for this webinar. So if you have questions, please type them into the tab that is called Q&A. Sorry, but there is too much multitasking if I start to pick up the hands as well. So please help us here and just use the tab Q&A in case you have questions. All right. So to kickstart discussions, what we would like to do right now is to launch a first very quick live poll question. So my colleague Ariana, who usually is always there in the background, could you please, Ariana, launch the first? Yes. So normally now you can see a pop-up on your screen which asks you which of the following Bologna reforms contributed from your point of view, to enhance internationalization at your institution. Internationalization understood in the broadest sense of it, so including Europeanization, if I can say so, so within the European higher education area. Please check all applicable options, and then we can have, for example, quality assurance, but we also have the common degree structure, bachelor's, master's, recognition of qualifications, the use of ECTS, or anything else, and in that case, you're welcome to share it in the Q&A box. All right. So normally you should have had some time to tick the answers that you think is relevant for your institution, and we will kickstart discussion from there. Ariana, I think you can close the pool now. You can close the pool now, and we can all go into the pools tab, which is on that side on my screen, and you click on the tab that is called closed, and there you can see the results. We can see the results. In addition, I have somebody, René Tönnissen, who says, yes, there is another option here, the development of programs and collaboration. Yes, this is also another point. The trend in the pool seems to say that the Bologna reform that has contributed most is the use of ECTS, closely followed by a common degree structure, bachelor's, master's, also the doctorate, and then also quite closely followed by recognition of qualifications. I have to say I expected quality assurance to go a bit higher, but that's good to see. All right, so for my speakers now, if you could all unmute yourself, perhaps that would be easier. I would like to elicit some comments on this, and then also we can start the discussion on what you would describe as the most important contribution or the most important contributions of the Bologna process to the enhancement of internationalization strategies at European universities. You can also just tell me in a challenging way that it has not contributed at all. I know some of you think that, so most welcome to share your views, and also have things changed because of or thanks to the Bologna process, and what is the added value of Bologna for individual universities to engage into internationalization. Who would like to start? Would Magali want to start? Yeah. Yes, go ahead. I'm muting myself so that I diminish.
Well, thank you, Therese. Of course, all the topics that were mentioned in the poll are very important, but the most important thing to me that really led to the enhancement of internationalization strategies is the fact that the minister set this goal of 20% of mobile students by 2020 during the Bologna Ministerial Conference in 2009 in Leuven-Louvain-la-Neuve, as Michael explained in the beginning. For me, that was really the push forward for national governments and for institutions to put this topic on the policy agenda. They all started to think about how to reach this goal, which actions they had to take to be able to reach the goal. And that happened on all levels. It was like people were shaken up. And of course, internationalization already existed before, and also mobility strategies existed before. But if you ask me, I would say that setting the goal as such was really an extra push to put this topic in the spotlight. And as far as I could see it, governments really started to create new national strategies, set their own goals. Some were more ambitious than the European 20%. And also governments as well as institutions, for example, they had to start to pay more attention to registration of mobility, because we also received guidelines from Eurostat, etc., on how to count and how to register mobility. So that was really the main push forward, according to me. And of course, all the items mentioned in the poll related to the different Bologna tools, like the European standards and guidelines for QA, recognition procedures, ECTS. Of course, they all help to facilitate mobility and cooperation, because after all, trust is the key issue in international cooperation. And also, the second item in the poll, the common degree structure, bachelor, masters, that all made it much more easy to be mobile for students and to switch between different countries and different cycles in their higher education. But my main message would be the goal of 20%. That was really the push forward.
Thank you, Magali. And also, I think it was very interesting to have precisely your system point of view, also to underline this aspect of vision setting, if I can say so. So really more than awareness raising, but really this push towards more awareness towards internationalization at system level. All right. I think Pauline is there with us as well. Would you like to comment on this as well from your institutional, but also from your researcher point of view, if you would like?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very interesting poll, and this is not exactly what I was expecting either. I would have thought that QA and common degree structure would be much higher than the other items, actually. Maybe I would like to give a more general comment or answer to the question, because I would say that what is very interesting in the connection between Bologna and internationalization is that beyond any specific Bologna-related reform, Bologna has been one of the main macro processes of change for higher education institutions in Europe in the last 2 decades, and one of the main drivers to internationalization. Internationalization here being understood in a very extensive meaning, like being more European and international as an institution. Okay, and so I think this Bologna has been something extremely important, but in a way that is not very easy to identify. It's very difficult, I think, to take Bologna and to measure the isolated effect of Bologna in terms of internationalization. I mean, in the last 2 decades, of course, higher education institutions have gone much more international in many, many ways. And you have different macro processes of internationalization going on. A very important one, for instance, being related to rankings, international ranking. This is something else, for example, that is going on. So Bologna, I would say it's quite hard to measure, to appreciate the specificity of that effect, but for sure, Bologna has been part of this. Maybe more, it's getting even more and more difficult to isolate this effect, because in a way, Bologna is being more and more invisible in higher education institutions' practices. Because when Bologna was a new process, when it was a big challenge to implement the different Bologna reforms, Bologna was very visible on the agenda for institution and government. And now it's not anymore as such, but it's not because there is not anymore this very this very awareness of Bologna that it's not there anymore, and the fact that institutions and countries have been mobilized in the last 2 decades to build a European higher education area did change something in terms of internationalization, I would say.
Thank you, Pauline. I would like to go to Marcus now, who has kept silent until now, if he also would like to share his view on this with us. Marcus?
Definitely, and I'd like to start by saying that my perspective is that of a university and that of an internationalization practitioner of some 25 years and a senior international officer at my university. And I'd like to offer a bit of a spoiler alert. I'm a bit of a critic of the Bologna process and its relevance to internationalization, particularly at Leighton. I was very pleased to see my personal answer getting most votes in the poll, that being the ECTS. It was a struggle for me between that and the 2-tier degree system. But if you consider that those were the first things that started to happen as a result of the Bologna process, I think they are still, if we look at them from today's perspective, they are things of the past, things that we easily take for granted. And if you had posed the question, what are the developments over the last 5 years in the Bologna process that are of particular consequence and importance to the practice of internationalization, I would have had a much harder time in finding an answer. So again, the important things, the very fundamental things for the practice of internationalization, they are a direct result, I believe, of the Bologna process, but in the past.
All right. Thank you, Marcus. Would you like to comment as well from your side, Michael?
Well, yeah, just from my perspective, I think there is. I found it interesting what I always said, but what Magali said about the 20% benchmark, which is also today a clear indication that we haven't reached the goal. Yeah, but I agree that it somehow changed something. In 2000, I mean, when the process started, mobility was an unquestioned goal and also value. And I remember that we did not only realize that we didn't make much progress on it, but also that we started to feel a little bit insecure on whether this is actually, and that became then an epithet often used, quality mobility or learning mobility, so that would be just mobility. So it needed a justification from pedagogical, from a learning point of view, why you actually wanted to have mobility. And I think it's just one of the examples where the Bologna process shows how it takes up something, often without a clear definition, promotes it for a while, and then in 2008-9 we found out that we had no definition actually for what we mean by mobility. Is that credit mobility? Is that degree mobility? Is it in or outgoing? And we also had no data on mobility. Nobody could actually say how much mobility was there in Europe before, and which has then been redefined and reused, and this goal has been set. And while we haven't reached the benchmark as inspired, we nevertheless can see that we have made some progress there. I completely agree. We did several studies at the time that the fact that governments had to take action there, it was handed down to the institutions, where for the first time between institutional leadership and the international office and colleagues, you had actually a discussion on mobility and what were the obstacles. And so I think it shows one of the virtues of the process indeed. But what I think actually made the difference is that you underpin this feeling of being European, which is kind of historic, cultural, whatsoever, with some concrete shared features in higher education. And I think that makes it also so strong, and probably explains also where it carries on.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think with this, we are continuing into a more specific question, which is mobility. And also because I see that there are questions flowing into the Q&A, so I would like to pick up some of those before launching the next live poll, for which I will leave you more time to answer. Sorry for that. We had some comment on that in the chat box. So the discussion would be really about mobility. If we want to zoom into it, as we used to know it, was, well, basically mostly physical and also not for everybody, right? We know that we are still struggling to reach some benchmarks here, but it has been mostly physical and also put on hold because of the current situation with the pandemic. So universities around the world are also increasingly looking at alternative ways to continue exchanges. So we would be interested to know from the speakers, how would you see the future of internationalization policies, which until now have been heavily driven by physical exchanges of students and also staff? And also, of course, if you think the Bologna process here could, for example, play a useful role here, I would like to link with some questions we have in the Q&A here. For example, we have Amagan who says, Bologna process helped the institutions to be more international, but it is mainly understood as the mobility of students and still is very limited when you compare the student numbers and those benefiting from mobility programs. So that's what I just said. And also with the new pandemic conditions, I believe internationalization at home should be more focused. Do you agree? I have another, and related to this, and I think this is a very important aspect of future discussions on mobility. Nora from Ireland asks, what does the panel think is the significance of mobility featuring into the next ministerial communique under the social dimension theme? So what do we do with inclusive student mobility in the next phase of the Bologna process? Okay, I will let you answer first because there are a few other questions, but more detailed ones on mobility as well. Perhaps we can start with Marcus this time.
Thank you very much. And I couldn't agree more with the questions and their sentiments, in the sense that internationalization truly is and should be understood as being much more than mobility of students or whoever else. And the COVID situation has very clearly demonstrated that. Still, in some of the conversations that I have with my colleagues, there seems to be a sense or loss of purpose, rather, of what are we all about, since mobility is not in the short term possible. So I don't know what the Rome communique holds or should hold, but certainly it should be much more than about mobility. That's it from me.
Sorry, it always takes me 1 second to unmute myself. Would anyone else among my speakers would like to share their view? Magali, perhaps?
Yes, thank you, Therese. Yes, and I can give some information on what is currently in the draft of the Rome communique. As Marcus says, he doesn't have an idea, so many of you probably don't have an idea yet what will be there. As Michael said just before, in our newest data that we have, we can see that EHEA-wide, we reach almost 10% of physical mobility instead of the goal of 20%. So there's a long way to go. And of course, it's not all about physical mobility. And therefore, in the draft of the Rome communique, on one hand, the target of 20% is reaffirmed, but on the other hand, next to that, and which is of course very important, it's also stressed that all learners should acquire international and intercultural competences through internationalization of curricula and participation in innovative international environments in their home universities or institutions. And also the importance of different forms of mobility, physically, blended, virtual mobility is mentioned. So the pandemic has given a boost to online learning and blended and virtual mobility. So indeed, internationalization strategies and policies for our future, they should also include these new forms of learning and teaching. And as mentioned in the Q&A, after all, it's not all about the figures and the data and reaching a benchmark, but it's really about students getting the international and intercultural competences that they need for their future life. So whether they get these competences through physical mobility or through other activities is maybe less relevant. So indeed, we should really focus also on all the other options to get all those competences and not only focus on physical mobility. And that's also how it is now mentioned in the draft of the Rome communique. And yes, one other thing on the question of Nora on social inclusion and mobility, I can say not as co-chair of the Global Policy Dialogue group, but as person working at the Flemish Ministry. For us, social inclusion and mobility is very important, and we run currently 2 European projects also together with Nora on this topic with Ireland. So we are really working on this and putting this also on the policy agenda in Europe and within the European higher education area. And if people want to have more information on that, we can share the website inclusivemobility.eu also in the chat, so people can get more information, because there will be policy recommendations, booklets, etc., drawn up and then published very shortly on that topic.
Thank you very much. Indeed, thank you, Magali. And yes, indeed, importantly, and I have the feeling we have an audience who's quite in tune with you on this. That there needs to be a more holistic view of internationalization, right? I'm just picking 2 other comments before going to Pauline for her view on this. We have in the Q&A box Eva, who also says Bologna definitely meant a push for internationalization as it facilitated mobility through the common structure, ECTS, etc. But looking at internationalization as we understand it now goes beyond mobility. Internationalization should be seen more comprehensively, including internationalization of curriculum at home, etc. Bologna prepared the ground for it. Yeah, you don't need to apologize, Eva, for being a comment more than a question. I think it very much resonates with what you just said. Paulina, would you like to also comment on this aspect?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. This is a very fascinating question. The question of internationalization vis-a-vis mobility, and so everyone in this audience are expert in higher education, international cooperation. So everyone would agree that internationalization of higher education definitely is not limited to mobility. Okay, so everyone agrees on this, and though. This moment, this crisis we're in now is really a stress test, because we're in a totally unexpected experiment. And the question is, okay, what is really left about internationalization once there is almost no more physical mobility going on? Okay, so in a way, we're all forced to consider and to qualify what is internationalization when it's not about physical mobility. So we have to do this for our students, because we know how important this is for our students to be in touch, to get familiar with international dimension. So obviously, all this debate about internationalization at home and about international content, more international content and competencies within curriculum, this is extremely important. But there is also the question of internationalization for staff and for institutional policies. So when internationalization is not only about mobility, this is definitely also about how internationalization is at the heart of the identity and of the strategy of the institution. This is about how you find international inspiration or reference point when you elaborate your institutional policy. This is how you develop more international interaction in research, for instance. So I think it's a very hard period we're in, but this is also a very exciting period about exploring, being forced to explore what is internationalization when it's not anymore physical mobility.
Thank you very much, Pauline. I think Marcus had a reaction or a response to what you just said, and then I'll pass the floor to Michael as well. Marcus, shortly?
Maybe it's a more general remark about the whole Bologna process. I think it was already true before the Corona crisis, but certainly it's been heightened by it. The fact that the pace of change when it comes to internationalization in a way exceeds what we can expect from the Bologna process. Ministers coming together every 2 or so many years, and of course things happening, but we need something also at the level of policy that is quicker and more able to respond to situations that are emerging.
Yes,
Okay. Go ahead.
I can respond just to what Marcus had said, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's not only true for internationalization, it's for a number of areas. We have also seen that in learning and teaching, for example, where you could see that the sector has in fact made a major move. The whole innovation comes basically bottom up in the institution. It doesn't come from institutional leadership. It's the staff, the students, which trigger it. And I think it's only in 2018 that in the communique something meaningful has been said about digitalization, for example, which didn't appear on the Bologna agenda before. So I think this is very different from what we had seen in the previous decade, from the structural changes that could be implemented somehow top down. We are now in a situation where many of the transformative movements, they come bottom up from the institutions, and it would be the task then of the Bologna process to think of how to react to it and probably on how to support it. And I think this is also becomes very clear when you will have a look at the forthcoming communique. Probably to something what Pauline said, I think that's absolutely right, that internationalization was so, it was so identical with the idea of physical mobility that this is a bit of shock. And I had the feeling that colleagues who are more on the international side of the institution, that they are not always well prepared to buy into it. So it's still the feeling you have to go there physical and have to been there. And I agree that also gives you, of course, a completely different cultural and learning experience if you have been there physically. I think the other point is that there is also still the worry that virtual would replace the physical mobility. There's a lot of angst around that. So whenever you talk about virtual mobility nowadays, you have to say, but this is not to replace physical mobility. Yeah. And then the other observation here, and this is also, I think, true for the crisis now, whenever there is a shortage or a problem, you tend to cut on internationalization. I mean, you can see that in institution when it is about distribution of fundings. You can see that in university association when it is about the agenda of the meeting. If there is no time, you discuss the international issues the next time. And I think we have also seen that here. Of course, in the pandemic situation, mobility became the first victim. So before you were closing down institutions, you already stopped traveling, and then this was also the reason that you basically interrupted many of the exchanges that you had. And I think it's also the one thing that is still enduring, because we still hear that from students which have problems to get visa and to get to their study destination. So I think that shows how vulnerable that is if it is focused so much or based so much on physical mobility.
Thank you, Michael. We had indeed a question on also on virtual exchange here in the Q&A box. It's quite a long one, so I won't read it. But basically, that virtual exchange should also be seen not just as a short-term solution to the disruption, to the emergency situations we are facing nowadays at institutions, but also a more long-term with a more long-term perspective, and perhaps also embedded into curriculum and into learning approaches, teaching approaches in another way, to advance internationalization at home for each student and also for the staff, etc. Would any of my panelists would like to comment a bit more on virtual exchange? Yes, Marcus, go ahead, please.
It's almost funny, except that it's nothing but funny. At the EHEA conferences, which I've been very involved with, the role of virtual learning and collaborative online learning has been a very small minority of session and only of interest to a select few people who are excited about the topic. I expect this to change dramatically in the years to come, and very shortly. I think this will become the mainstream.
Thank you. Would Magali and Pauline also have a comment on this? Because you have said already quite much on virtual, on mobility in general, I think, yes? Okay, well, if so, I think we can perhaps move, sorry, I'm also trying to multitask here and pick my questions. If so, perhaps I'll move to some of the questions that are in the Q&A box. I'll just take one or two right now, and then we can move to the third and last part of our webinar already. I have a question here, which is about external funding, basically. Bologna has been politically successful, and also, but then how can we imagine, would it be interesting to imagine what the situation would be without all the EU financial support for mobility building, joint degrees, and also, as insiders would know, the EU funding is also supporting peer learning exercises and things like that. How much of this internationalization would have happened without external funding? Well, that we cannot know, right? But I would like perhaps to ask my panel to comment. What do you, how do you feel this overall international cooperation framework could work in interaction precisely with funding opportunities, especially at EU level?
I just very quickly, I think we are really privileged in a way of having that, because you can see that in other regions, how much more difficult it is to get interinstitutional exchanges and cross-border collaboration going. It's not necessarily because it is so much money that you need for this, but because you have to first to solve the question, who's going to pay for that and who's going to have the benefit, and I think the Commission funding helps us enormously to overcome this kind of obstacle. So I think we are in a good situation, and it's just, I mean, it's a bit also interesting to see how this Bologna process as such actually works, given the parallelity of the European higher education area and what has become now the European education area, the European Union having its own process, but at the same time participating in the Bologna process. Difficult to explain, you don't have to understand it, but miraculously, this works actually quite well.
Yeah, if I can just add a comment here to what Michael just said, I think it would be wrong to envisage EU programs only in terms of an available toolbox and a purse for European and international higher education cooperation. And Bologna would be the political engine, and then you would have the EU providing the tools and money, okay? What is extremely interesting in what happened in the last years and well, since the beginning of the Bologna process, is also how the Bologna process has, in a way, brought back universities back in on the EU agenda. and universities and the role of knowledge and universities for EU economy, for EU social inclusion, for EU global strategies are really, really important now. And this is certainly an effect of the Bologna process.
Thank you, Paulina. Magali, would you like to add a word right now or later? Yeah, later. Okay. I think we have a bit more than 10 minutes left, and I don't know you, but I cannot believe it because I have the feeling we just started talking, basically. So let's try to make the best use we can of those 10 minutes. I apologize in advance to all those who submitted questions. Probably we won't be able to pick them all. We'll try. So second little live poll question for our audience. Ariana, could you please activate it? It is very much related to the crisis situation, but actually what we would like to know with this is also how would you see your priorities for the future? So the question is, what are your concerns regarding internationalization at present and with the crisis situation? Please check all applicable options. As for the first one, so you could have, for example, general planning uncertainty, restrictions caused by the pandemic. Internationalization becomes less of a priority. So many issues to fix at home already, given the difficulties also caused by the pandemic in general. You could also have concerns about the decrease of student mobility. You could have concerns regarding the decrease of staff mobility, be it for educational, but also for research purposes, circulation of researchers, decrease in general in international cooperation, a decrease in the institution's income, which might also be an issue in some parts of Europe or in some for some institutions that rely also on the fees from international students. The likelihood of funding cuts affecting international activities in the aftermath of the pandemic crisis, and supposedly in a context of general economical crisis for the country, or any other thing you would like to underline, and you're welcome to share your comment in the Q&A box. All right. So please check the options you would like to. And we already have some comments also for additional options or considerations. And oops, sorry, it jumps from up to down. Welfare, for example, both physical and mental, of employees, staff, but also students. That might be another point, another concern. All right, Ariana, can you close the poll? And then we all go under the tab pools, which is there, and closed. I'm doing it at the same time. Oh, what we can see is general planning uncertainty, of course. We don't really know what's ahead of us. The second one is the decrease of student mobility, despite all we discussed just right now. And we also can see internationalization becomes less of a priority given the difficulties caused by the pandemic. So internationalization kind of losing momentum, if I can say so, in the midst of other policy priorities for the institution. The decrease of staff mobility is quite concerning as well, and this combined with also likelihood of funding cuts affecting internationalization activities. Less people seem to be preoccupied by the decrease in international cooperation in general. It's good. We'll continue talking to each other. So perhaps I would like to ask my panel to react to this, and also perhaps to share your considerations against those results, but also views on how could then the Bologna process in this global setting address that in a way? What are the hot topics on the global higher education scene that you think could be discussed or should be discussed in the Bologna context? What kind of action could be useful, and also what would be useful for the individual universities' internationalization activities? This is a twofold question, actually. Who would like to start? Pauline has not started yet. Would you like to share views, Pauline?
Yeah, well, I'm beginning, but I'm beginning with big questions, big political questions. I'm sorry, this is a bias as a political scientist. So the question is, what's hot on the global higher education scene? Maybe a way to answer the question would be to say, okay, on the global higher education scene, people are not saying higher education should be more global, or we have to do more we have to do more internationalization as such. So I think the real question is, what is internationalization for? And this is the same question as what's hot on the global higher education scene. And I think that the main question today, it's about the role of universities in our troubled society, and what would be a global coordinated answer to this. The question is not that intrinsically it's good to be more international. The question is how can more internationalized university, how can they contribute to the big challenges that our societies are facing? How universities do contribute to change the world? I mean, this is the big and the most important question. To me, so this is what's hot. The big topic is on the role of universities today. And we can see this is also the case at the European level. Because now, actually, what is very hot at the EU level is about the definition or the redefinition of the role of universities. And this should be an important point in the global policy forum, in the Bologna context, more than questions of implementation and this kind of things.
Thank you, Pauline. Well, we have the co-chair of the coordination group on the Global Policy Forum under Bologna. So Magali, would you like to comment on this?
Well, yes, I must say that it has been quite a challenge lately to also organize the Global Policy Forum in a completely virtual setting, as the complete ministerial conference will be online this year. And we are still working also on the program. So yeah, in some way, this is also a bit linked, as we have seen in the previous months, with the option B in the poll. Internationalization becomes less of a priority. Also in the Bologna process, we have seen that in times that it gets difficult, internationalization might be the global dimension of the Bologna process might be the first to have difficulty to be still there in the program, and that is related to many different aspects, very, very practical aspects as well. But in the end, we will have a short session on the global dimension during the ministerial conference. And we will have some global topics discussed there. But to come back to the hot topic and what Pauline just mentioned, I also agree that, well, at least for me, one of the hot topics is really get into flexible learning and teaching. And this, as such, has also a link with many different aspects. It goes on one side, it goes hand in hand with the current digitalization wave, if I can call it like this, because through online learning and teaching, we can offer many more courses in a flexible way, engaging teachers and learners from all over the world in one course or one program. On the other hand, it can also lead to more inclusion, as flexible learning and teaching can facilitate different groups of students to have access to higher education. because they might be able to study at their own place and time. And this flexible learning and teaching, it can be taken up in regular degree programs, but it can also be part of new forms of short courses that are popping up. And I believe universities should really be able in the near future and in the coming decade, let's say, to be able to develop new programs in a very quick way to respond to the needs of the changing society. People need reskilling, they need upskilling all through their professional life. So not only for regular students, but in the way of lifelong learning, in the sense of lifelong learning, this is very important. So I think our higher education should be ready for this and should respond to this need. And this is, of course, something that is going on not only in the European higher education area, but that is going on worldwide. So I believe that this is as general topic with many subtopics linked to it, something that we could take up in the global context in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Magali. Marcus, would you like to share your view on this? The future.
Just very quickly. In a moment of crisis, it's often that people, institutions, nations, and regions turn inward and start focusing on themselves. However, the real drivers of internationalization today, lack of adequate supply in some countries, the wickedness of problems that we need to resolve globally, the competition for best talent, they haven't changed. They will not change. And I think it's a matter of how we do internationalization rather than whether we do it or not.
Thank you, Marcus. I just would like to pick up also one comment from the chat box that says, it's from Martin Pritchell, whom some of you might know from the Association of Conservatoires. Should we not also talk about internationalization as a strategic tool for institutional development? So improve your quality, improve your education by cooperating with others internationally. It goes much beyond mobility, indeed. And I think this more like holistic view of internationalization, if I may say so, has really has been like a red thread in all our discussion since we started discussing at least the point on mobility. There are several other questions still in the chat box. I would like to first ask Michael if you would like to react to the last round of big questions as we call them.
Yeah, probably on the. I won't say anything on the big topics. I think that's fully recognized. It is not about counting mobilities here or so. It's really the question on how you situate a university globally. And I agree also with what Marcus said, that in principle, I mean, the drivers and the forces are still in place. But I mean, we see that here from the chat that internationalization is suddenly a bit less a priority for the reasons that Magali has also mentioned. When you look at it, it's fairly rational. You know, you can't go abroad, so you wait. My question would be, how long can we wait? You know, I mean, we are waiting for a vaccine, yeah, which might come in half a year, which might come a year or in 2 years. So maybe we should think of how to make good use of the time. And it seems to be a good period of time to probe, to explore these virtual exchanges and to really cultivate them. At the moment, they are replacing the physical mobility. In the long term, I think they would just help to complement them and open new ways of exchanging and collaborating. And I think that could be really interesting. So in a way, it's a pity that the Commission hasn't really decided to extend the Erasmus mobility funding also to virtual exchanges. Because at the moment, I think not many people have really a track record on virtual exchanges. It could have been a good opportunity to explore that now in a situation where we can't do many things physically. So that's what I would have seen, also to find these very practical ways of how we can have more global exchanges.
Thank you very much.
And just one more point. I'm actually glad to see that so few people are worried about cuts on funding. I guess it also depends a little bit where you are, in what system or in what type of institution. But my worry would be that in the medium to long term, that they would come. We know that in publicly funded higher education systems, the cuts come always a little bit later. But I guess internationalization could be one of the areas where you would see, probably not at European Union level, but at some national levels, cuts coming. Let's try to prevent them.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we need to more or less wrap up soon, also because I see that in our audience, people might also have other things to do, or other places, or the screens to go. I don't know. I just would like to read a last round, for me at least, of Q&As, and ask you for a last reaction, and then we will conclude. And these last reactions are for the could relate to what we could call a European model for internationalization, and the care and the way we take for making it. For example, I have here a very interesting comment. It's from Ahmal Jamal, who says, I think internationalization is not limited only to mobility. Indeed, the most important for me is to disseminate the European values in higher education. We have another comment that do not really relate, but to some extent cover the same field. Camille Bulot from ULB says, to what extent do you think the internationalization aspects of the Bologna process are modeled on the US system? Effort to catch up on the global scene. Is there a way we can take the internationalization forward and promote a European model? So this is really, these comments are not really in the same field, let's say, but this prompts me into asking you perhaps for a last round to comment on what is, after all, that specific, and that we should try to keep specific, coming from our European side of the story, if there is anything to be preserved as specific, at least in this European side of the story. Would somebody like to comment on this, and then also combine with your last words for this webinar? No.
Well, I start with the.
Okay, Michael, thank you.
I start with values, and I completely agree, Ahmed. And they also feature quite strongly in the upcoming Bologna communiqué. You read this in the 2018 communiqué and in the 2020 communiqué as well. And I think what is even more is that we will not content us with talking about values, but also making sure that they are enshrined in law and respected. At least that is the consensus in the BFUG. Then about whether it is modeled on the US system, that's interesting. I had never seen it like this, because we are actually doing things which are not really popular in the US, like short-term mobility, and also this whole collaboration partnership approach, that I hadn't seen it that way.
Thank you, Michael. Would somebody else like to comment on this briefly? Is that a hand, Marcus? Yes, this is a, yeah, go ahead, please.
It was my very, very uncoordinated hand gesture. Yes, I think the thing that Europe could export with greater benefits still is mass participation in internationalization. And of course, it's mostly evident through mobility, and we already agree that internationalization is more than mobility, but the way in which institutions and their internal and external stakeholders participate in the development of internationalization is something that we could be more proud of and make more visible to our global partners. That's it from me.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself. Yes, Magali, would you like to give us your conclusions and perhaps last comment and answer on this?
Yes, thank you. Yes, not really a reaction to the last questions, but something that I'm taking with me as member of the Bologna follow-up group and co-chair of the Global Policy Dialogue group. Because we have seen that since the first Bologna Policy Forum in 2009, we have seen that it's not easy to have sustained policy dialogue and policy cooperation in between ministerial conferences. There has been several working groups working on this external dimension, as it was called in the beginning of the Bologna process. And we still struggle with the question on how to connect with countries and organizations worldwide to keep the dialogue going in between ministerial conferences. So this is just personally. I have two ideas on how we could further work on this within the Bologna process. On the one hand, I think it's important in everything that we do or organize within the European higher education area to try and look beyond the borders of the EHEA. And for example, in my case, I'm also active in the ASEM process, a cooperation between Europe and Asia. And I'm always trying to connect both processes. And for example, just invite some Asian colleagues to a peer learning activity or to a conference organized in the Bologna context, and also the other way around. Because after all, many of the topics that we are working on and that we are discussing are the same in the different world regions. And I believe that it's only when we have a better understanding of the frameworks and the tools and the way of working in these other regions of the world that we can really build up trust as a basis for future cooperation around the world. And secondly, maybe very practical, within the next Bologna working period, we could maybe try to organize the work on the global dimension in a different way. Maybe the Bologna process should define 1 or 2 central themes for the coming 3 years on which she would like to work with the global partners. And then this working group on global policy dialogue could organize some very specific activities on these topics. And to define the topics, we could have a look, for example, in the new Bologna implementation report that will be published next month. So, for example, when I look in the draft now, I see in the chapter on internationalization that it's, for example, mentioned that there's still a lot of work to do for many countries on the topic of social inclusion and mobility, which was also mentioned here earlier. So, for example, this could be a topic to work on global level, but there could also be other topics. So maybe, as we have seen that it's quite difficult for this working group in the last 10 years to really be very practical and really work on global dialogue between conferences, that we could make it or tackle it in a different way and make it very practical and really take 1 or 2 topics to work very concretely on with other world regions. So that's a personal idea from my side to conclude.
Thank you very much, Magali, and thanks for taking this forward also in the Bologna context as such. Now, I would like to give the floor to Pauline for her last concluding words, but I don't see you, Pauline, anymore. Are you still there? Pauline, are you still there?
No. Okay.
I think, unfortunately, we lost Pauline in some way. Yes, I think we unfortunately lost Pauline in some way. Pauline, are you back? Doesn't seem like. All right. I'm afraid I'll need to wrap up now then this webinar because we already exceeded by 15 minutes, but those were really interesting 15 minutes. So I guess we are forgiven for this. I would like to thank once again my speakers here, Michael, Marcus, Magali, and Pauline, for your contributions and sharing your reflections with us in this webinar. I would like to thank all of you who have participated, because this was a quite dynamic discussion as well. We had many questions in the Q&A, many reactions, many comments. I apologize that we were not able to address them all. There were some other things that I would have loved to pick, but time is running. And I also would like to remind you that we are trying to continue this conversation also on Twitter. So if you are on Twitter, EUA has an account called EUA Tweets in one word. And we also posted the questions that were featured in the polls right now, but with the idea that if you would like to comment, you're most welcome to comment as well. My final words here are just to announce the next webinar of the series. So this was the second webinar of the Bologna series, And our next webinar will be already next week, I think. No? Yes, next week on the 20th of October. It's also on a Tuesday. It's at the same time. It's also at 2 Central European time. And the topic will be digitally enhanced learning in the EHEA. And I will be very pleased to see you again next week if you can make it. Registration is still open. The link is there. And it's also easy to find on the EUA website in case you would like to join the next one. Thank you very much and have a very nice afternoon. And thanks also again to the speakers, and see you next time, I hope. Bye.